Welcome to this episode of Preaching the Word, a video series on preaching sponsored by the Dunk Tank and the Berman Ministry Center. My name is Dr. Stephen Reasor, and I'm a preacher and author, and I teach preaching at Berman University in Lacombe, Alberta. In today's episode, we begin looking at the different dynamic sermon structures, starting with a few plot forms. My favorite plot form was described by Eugene Lowry in his book, The Homiletical Plot. If you've completed our sermon process series of videos, you were introduced to Lowry's plot form already. A plot sermon form is sometimes called a narrative form. I know it can be confusing, but the plot form does not always mean you are preaching from a biblical narrative or using lots of stories. Rather, the sermon itself moves through the common stages of plot or narrative. Stage 1 is the initiation of conflict, or a question or other ambiguity. Stage 2 builds suspense or more closely examines the nature of the problem. The third stage is the climax or the turning point of the plot. And finally, there is a working out of the effects of the solution or the implications of that plot twist. These elements of plot are what make a narrative sermon narrative and do not need to include stories in order to be considered narrative. One strength of this form is that it communicates in a way familiar to everyone who likes stories. That's all of us. Anyone who reads books or watches shows and movies or just likes to listen to friends tell stories. Another strength is that because the end of the sermon is not in view from the very start, then the interest of the hearer is held captive until the climax or until the plot twist, where they are surprised to find themselves somewhere new. The central role of ambiguity or conflict in holding people's attention is important, but if not done correctly, it can feel manipulative. The question, the problem, the ambiguity must be genuine. One obstacle to a sermon plot form is that the preacher has to raise a legitimate problem or ask a profound question and then seek a profound answer to the question or problem from the text. This takes a lot of time and effort, more time and effort than merely, sharing a few gems from the Bible. But the payoff is a sermon that engages and transforms. The plot form takes several shapes. There's the Lowry plot loop that we discussed before. His moves are 1, upsetting the equilibrium, in other words, introducing ambiguity. 2, analyzing the discrepancy. 3, finding the clue to resolution. 4, experiencing the gospel from a new vantage point. And finally, anticipating the consequences of this new understanding. A possible series of moves for a sermon on Luke 17 could be move 1, upsetting the equilibrium. No mulberry trees growing in any lakes means that we all lack faith. Move number 2 of analyzing the discrepancy. Neither secret knowledge nor ridiculous boldness will conjure up faith. Move number 3, which is the clue to resolution. Faith is only possible when the master is the center of concern. Move number 4, where we experience the gospel, we would say the master's will is the grace to which our faith responds. And finally, move number 5, where we anticipate the consequences, we would say we can demonstrate God's grace with our obedient faith today. Another type of plot-based sermon would introduce a conflict, bring about rising action, have a space for reflection, a teachable moment, finally come to the climax, and then find resolution. A sermon about faith might follow this series of moves. The conflict. Faith and works have battled each other for control of our lived-out religion for 2,000 years. Next is the rising action. James favors works and says, faith without works is dead, while Paul favors faith, and he says, righteousness comes only from faith, not works. The pause for reflection, that teaching moment. We may have ulterior motives like fear or pride in choosing one side or the other. This teaching moment, this pause for reflection, comes before the climax because until the climax is reached, we pay very close attention to the sermon, and so we can reflect and weigh things. But then we reach the climax. Faith is an all-encompassing commitment to faithfully serve the Master. And the resolution of it all? True faith leads to faithfulness, which we often call works. Instead of conflict now, the sermon can also begin with a legitimate, heartfelt question and consider inadequate answers, then find a satisfactory answer, and then finally explore its meaning. So this plot form centers on the question. So potentially from Luke 17, I could say, how can we have more faith? Some of the inadequate answers to that question are, it isn't the nature of the mustard seed, and it's not the movability of the mulberry tree, or the suitability of the lake that really matter. Those are inadequate answers. The satisfactory answer is, if the Master wants a tree in a lake, well, then that's where it will go. What does it mean? Well, the meaning is our abilities are not important. Only the Master's will is important. So these have been a few various types of plot forms, plot possibilities. Your assignment for the plot form sermon is to sketch out how you might shape a sermon that you're currently working on to fit one of these types of plot forms. Outline the parts of the story and discuss how you will structure your sermon and decide what it will look like in each part. When you've finished your assignment, join me for the next episode of Preaching the Word, where we will explore this next dynamic structure called the 4-page sermon. See you then.